Bradford County, Pennsylvania, July 10th, 1880. Mid-morning, already hot. Samuel Horton had been grading roads for the Bradford County Commissioners since 1873. He was 52 years old, a heavy-set and methodical man who had spent 30 years moving earth for one public authority or another, and who had developed a particular competence at reading the subsurface before his crew disturbed it. The slight variations in ground compression, the change in vegetation that indicated previous disturbance, the way drainage patterns told you what the layers below had been doing for years. He was not educated in any formal sense, but he was expert in the way that 30 years of a single practice produces expertise. And on the morning of July 10th, 1880, he was setting grade stakes for the new road connection between Sayre Borough and the Athens Township line, when he noticed that the ground on the east side of the proposed grade had a character that his experience told him to investigate before his crew's picks went into it. He called his crew to hold. He knelt at the edge of the grade line and pressed his hand into the soil and felt what he had learned to feel, the particular firmness of deliberately disturbed and resettled ground. The kind of compaction that comes from a depression being filled with intentional care rather than natural deposition. He marked the location with a stick, and he told his crew to start 20 feet south of it, and he went to the borough office to report the anomaly. Because Bradford County had mound sites in its record, and the commissioners had standing instructions about what to do when roadwork encountered them. By the afternoon of July 11th, the site had been opened. The Bradford County Commissioners had engaged a local physician named Dr. Albert Foote to supervise any archaeological opening that came up during road construction, a precaution following an incident in 1877 when a road crew in neighboring Sullivan County had destroyed a mound before anyone with relevant knowledge could assess it. Foote was 60 years old, a general practitioner who had educated himself in the emerging science of physical anthropology through the publications of the Smithsonian Institution and the American Anthropologist, and who was regarded in Bradford County as the closest thing to a qualified assessor available without bringing someone from Philadelphia. He was there when the crew opened the first burial. The site contained 68 individuals. They were arranged in a pattern that Foote described in his written report, a document he submitted to the Bradford County Commissioners, and which survives in the Bradford County Historical Society's archive, as systematic and deliberate, showing evidence of intentional placement over an extended period with consistent orientation protocols. The orientations were consistent. All 68 individuals had the skulls directed toward the northeast. The burial depth was uniform, between 3 and 4 feet across the entire site, with no variation that would indicate multiple periods of use. Of the 68 individuals, the great majority fell within the range of normal human skeletal development that Foote was familiar with from the medical literature. The long bone lengths and cranial dimensions were unremarkable. 3 were not. Foote called the 3 anomalous individuals to the attention of his 2 physician colleagues, a man named Dr. William Bryce, 47 years old, who practiced in Athens Township, and Dr. Charles Kellum, 39 years old, who had recently arrived in Sayre from a practice in Elmira, New York, where he had done hospital work and had some experience with anatomical study. All 3 men examined the 3 skulls. All 3 produced written descriptions. All 3 descriptions are in the Bradford County Historical Society's archive, in the same file as Foote's report. All 3 agree on the physical characteristics. The skulls had bony projections above the orbital ridges. Not soft tissue anomalies, not the swelling of disease or injury, but bony outgrowths, extensions of the frontal bone, bilateral, symmetrical, rising from the superior margin of each eye socket at a consistent angle and to a consistent height. Foote measured the projections on the best preserved skull at 1 3/4 inches above the orbital rim, with a base width of approximately 1 inch, tapering to a blunt point. Bryce's measurement agreed to within 1/8 of an inch. Kellam's assessment added the observation that the bone structure of the projections was continuous with the frontal bone, not a pathological addition, not a calcium deposit, but a structural feature of the skull's architecture, as though the skull had been formed with this feature present, rather than having developed it as a secondary condition. Normal human anatomy does not include this feature. The frontal bone of the human skull has a supraorbital ridge, a modest thickening along the superior orbital margin that varies in prominence between individuals, but it does not produce bony projections of the scale Foote and his colleagues documented. The medical literature available to Foote in 1880 contained no description of bilateral, symmetrical, structural bony projections above the eye sockets as a pathological condition. The three physicians spent considerable time attempting to fit the feature into a known pathological category, and could not. Foote's report records this explicitly. The projections observed in specimens designated A, B, and C do not correspond to any pathological condition described in the available clinical literature. All three anomalous skulls also showed dimensions that placed them at the upper extreme of the standard human cranial volume range. Foote used the water fill measurement, filling the skull through the foramen magnum and measuring volume displaced, and obtained figures of 1,900, 1,880, and 1,940 cubic centimeters respectively. These are not impossible in the standard human range, but they are at the far upper limit, in the 98th percentile or above. 3 individuals from a population of 68, all at the upper extreme of cranial volume, all 3 with the same bilateral structural anomaly, constitutes a pattern within the population rather than a coincidental clustering of individual outliers. Foote filed his report with the Bradford County Commissioners on July 20, 1880. The report included his own description, the supporting assessments from Bryce and Kellam, and a recommendation that the skeletal material be submitted to a qualified anatomist for formal study. The commissioners forwarded the report to the Pennsylvania State Museum in Harrisburg, which was the relevant state institution for such referrals. A letter from the State Museum's director acknowledging receipt of the report and requesting that the physical specimens be sent to Harrisburg for examination is in the Bradford County Historical Society's file. The letter is dated July 31, 1880. The skulls were sent to Harrisburg in August 1880. The Pennsylvania State Museum's accession records for 1880, available through the Pennsylvania State Archives, do not contain any entry for skeletal material from Bradford County. The accession catalog for human remains received in 1880 lists 14 entries, none from Bradford County, and none describing material with the characteristics Foote documented. The State Museum's correspondence files for 1880, a partial series with gaps, contain a letter dated September 9, 1880, from the museum's director to an unnamed correspondent at the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology, which reads, "The material from the Bradford County referral has been assessed and will be forwarded per your request of August 14th. The August 14th letter from the Bureau to which this refers is not in the correspondence file. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology accession records for 1880 do not list any material from Bradford County, Pennsylvania. The 65 standard individuals from the Sayre site, the ones without bony projections, were reburied at the site under the direction of the Bradford County Commissioners following the Pennsylvania State Museum's assessment. The reburial is documented in the Commissioners' minutes for September 1880. The 3 anomalous individuals are not mentioned in the Commissioners' minutes after August 1880. They are not mentioned in any subsequent document in the Bradford County Historical Society's file. They went to Harrisburg, and then, per the museum director's September letter, to the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian's record does not contain them. A Freedom of Information request filed in September 2014 by the researcher Robert Daniels requesting all Bureau of American Ethnology records related to Bradford County, Pennsylvania, for the period 1878 through 1890, received a partial response, covering general correspondence. The specific category of physical specimen accession records was withheld under Exemption 3, citing a statute governing federal museum collections that Daniels's attorney subsequently identified as applying to ongoing active collections, not to material received in 1880 and not catalogued. The inapplicability of the exemption to historical uncatalogued material was noted in a follow-up inquiry. The Bureau did not respond to the follow-up. The Sayre case does not stand alone in the record. The bony projections above the orbital ridges, the feature that Foote, Bryce, and Kellam could not place in any known pathological category, appear in a small number of other documented contexts in the 19th century American archaeological record. A mound opening in Tompkins County, New York, in 1871, reported by a local newspaper editor named Robert Harrison in the Ithaca Journal of May that year, described two skulls from a burial complex with similar features. Harrison used the term horn-like projections, which were collected by an unnamed representative and have not been located since. A construction-era find in Montgomery County, Ohio, reported in the Dayton Daily Journal in 1883, described a single skull with bilateral bony projections above the eye sockets. The skull was examined by a physician, reported to the County Historical Society, and is not present in the Historical Society's current collection. A survey of the known anomalous cranial finds in the 19th century Ohio Valley archaeological record, compiled by the independent researcher James Baines and published in 2001 through the Great Lakes Antiquity Society, identifies 11 cases of reported bony projections above the orbital ridges in pre-Columbian burial contexts, none of which is present in any accessible institutional collection. The pattern is not coincidental. 11 cases, 11 disappearances. The same institutional trajectory each time. Local report, referral to state institution, Smithsonian contact, no accession record. The technical question of what the bony projections represent anatomically has not been answered, because the specimens that would allow answer have not been available to any independent researcher. Within the framework of anatomically modern human variation, bilateral, symmetrical bony projections of the scale Foote documented. Structural features of the frontal bone, not pathological growths, do not have a recognized medical category. Within the framework of paleoanthropology, bony projections above the orbital rims are a feature associated with archaic hominid species. Homo neanderthalensis and Homo heidelbergensis both show pronounced supraorbital tori, but at morphological scales that are specifically distinct from what Foote documented. The Sayre projections were structural, but not at the scale of archaic supraorbital tori. They occupied a middle ground between anatomically modern human cranial architecture and archaic hominin cranial architecture that does not have a category in either framework. The Sayre site is now within the incorporated area of Sayre Borough in Bradford County. The road that Samuel Horton was grading on the morning of July 10, 1880, was completed and is a standard borough road. The ground disturbed by the July 1880 opening was re-established during road construction and is now under the road surface. The portion of the site not under the road, the eastern margin, where Foote recorded the most anomalous material, is a private residential parcel. The Bradford County Historical Society's archive holds Foote's report, Bryce's assessment, and Kellam's assessment in the same file. The file has never been digitized. 3 physicians sat together at a site in Bradford County in July 1880 and examined skulls that did not fit the medical literature and wrote down what they found. And what they found has been in the archive since 1880, and what it described has been in the Smithsonian since August of the same year, in a location the Smithsonian's accession records do not identify. Foote was 60 years old. Bryce was 47. Kellam was 39. They were careful men doing a careful job in a county that had given them an unusual problem, and they handled it correctly. They documented it. They referred it. They let the institution decide. The institution decided to keep it, and then to forget it, and then to deny that the accession records for 1880 contain any entry from Bradford County. They are correct that the accession records contain no such entry. That is the problem. Albert Foote's report to the Bradford County Commissioners, written on July 20th, 1880, is 11 pages in his careful physician's hand. The Bradford County Historical Society's copy is the original, the Commissioner's record copy, retained in the administrative files. Foote was a man who wrote as he practiced medicine, methodically, with every observation documented before conclusions were drawn, with no statement made that the physical evidence did not support. The 11 pages are almost entirely description: the site dimensions, the burial count, the skeletal orientation, the burial depth, the associated material culture, which in this case was sparse, consisting primarily of worked flint tools and ceramic fragments consistent with a woodland period date, and the anatomical observations on each of the 68 individuals. The 3 anomalous individuals each receive a dedicated section, in which Foote describes the bony projections, the cranial volume measurements, and the long bone dimensions with the precision of a physician who has been examining bones for 30 years. The section on the bony projections is the most significant and the most carefully written. Foote was aware that what he was describing had no medical category available to him, and he was also aware, as a physician in 1880 who read the American Anthropologist and the Smithsonian Institution's annual reports, that he was working in a period when the physical anthropology of the American mound builder populations was actively contested between researchers who believed the mounds were built by a vanished race distinct from the historical Native American populations, and researchers who believed the mounds were built by the ancestors of existing Native American groups. The physical anthropology of the mound builders mattered politically as well as scientifically, because the question of a vanished race had implications for federal Indian policy. The argument that Native Americans had displaced an earlier, more sophisticated population was used to justify displacement in turn. Foote understood this context. He wrote about the anomalous skulls in terms as purely anatomical as he could achieve, avoiding the political vocabulary of the vanished race debate, describing what he saw and measuring what he could measure, and noting that the features did not fit the clinical literature, without offering an explanation for why they did not fit. The 3 physicians' combined assessments constitute the most rigorous documentation in the Sayre record. Foote brought Bryson Kellum to the site specifically because he understood that a single observer's account of anatomically unprecedented material would be vulnerable to dismissal on grounds of observer error or professional inexperience. 3 physicians, independently examining the same 3 skulls and producing consistent written descriptions of the bony projections and the cranial volumes, constitute a degree of evidentiary corroboration that cannot be attributed to shared bias or to a single observer's misidentification. Bryce was 47 and had been practicing in Bradford County for 18 years. Kellum had hospital anatomy experience from Elmira. Foote had 30 years of medical practice. All 3 saw the same thing. All 3 documented it. All 3 assessments are in the archive. What all 3 assessments describe has not been in any accessible location since August 1880. The Bradford County Historical Society's archive is on Market Street in Towanda, Pennsylvania, in a building that has housed the collection since 1915. The Sayre site file, folder 14-B in the Bradford County Survey records, contains Foote's report, Bryce's 2-page assessment, Kellum's 1-page assessment, the Commissioner's correspondence with the Pennsylvania State Museum, and the museum director's letter of July 31, 1880, requesting that the specimens be sent to Harrisburg. There is a gap in the correspondence after the museum's July 31st letter and before a November 1880 commissioner's minutes entry noting that the Sayre burial matter had been resolved by federal referral. The November minutes entry does not explain what federal referral means in this context, or which federal institution received the referral. It is the last reference to the Sayre find in the commissioner's administrative records. The pattern of bony projections above the orbital ridges, the feature that makes the Sayre case anatomically distinct from the straightforward, anomalous size finds in the broader 19th century American record, appears in one other context with documented evidentiary weight. The Denisovan hominin population, identified through ancient DNA analysis of finger bone material recovered from Denisova Cave in Siberia and published in 2010, is known from dental remains showing a crown size and root structure significantly larger than anatomically modern human equivalents. The Denisovan skeletal remains that have been identified and published are too fragmentary to allow cranial reconstruction, but protein analysis of the available material indicates Denisovans were present across an enormous geographic range, from Siberia to Southeast Asia to the Tibetan Plateau, over a period spanning approximately 400,000 to 50,000 years ago. The specific cranial features that would distinguish Denisovan anatomy from anatomically modern human anatomy are not established in the literature, because the material available for analysis is insufficient. The bony projections above the orbital ridges documented at Sayre in 1880 are, in the current state of paleoanthropological knowledge, unattributable to any known hominin population. They are either a previously undocumented pathological variant in the anatomically modern human range, which the medical evidence does not support at the frequency documented by 3 physicians in a population of 68 individuals, or they represent a morphological characteristic of a population that is not fully anatomically modern human. This is the conclusion that the institutional framework declines to reach, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the evidence that would allow the conclusion to be evaluated scientifically is not accessible. 3 physicians documented 3 skulls with bilateral structural bony projections above the orbital rims, absent from any medical category, in a Bradford County burial complex in July 1880. The skulls went to the Pennsylvania State Museum in August 1880, and from the museum to the Smithsonian in September 1880, per the museum director's letter. The Smithsonian has no record of receiving them. The 3 physicians' written assessments are in the Bradford County Historical Society archive. The skulls are not anywhere that an independent researcher can reach them. The question of what population produced people with bilateral structural bony projections above the orbital ridges in pre-Columbian Pennsylvania cannot be answered without the physical evidence. The physical evidence has been in institutional custody since September 1880, and the institution that holds it declines to acknowledge holding it. Albert Foote was 60 years old. William Bryce was 47. Charles Kellum was 39. They wrote down what they saw. The archive has kept their words for 144 years. What their words describe has not been visible for the same period. The archive is open Monday through Saturday. The skulls are not there. Samuel Horton was 52 years old on the morning of July 10, 1880, when he pressed his hand into the soil on the east side of the grade line and felt the particular firmness of deliberately disturbed and resettled ground. He had spent 30 years learning that firmness through his palms. He stopped his crew. He went to the borough office. He followed the standing instructions because Bradford County had standing instructions, and he was a man who followed them. He brought in Albert Foote, who brought in William Bryce and Charles Kellum, and the 3 of them sat together in Bradford County in July 1880 and examined skulls that did not fit the medical literature, and wrote down what they found. Foote was 60 years old. Bryce was 47. Kellum was 39. 3 careful men doing a careful job. Foote's 11 pages are in folder 14B at the Bradford County Historical Society in Towanda. Bryce's 2 pages are there. Kellum's 1 page is there. The archive is open Monday through Saturday. What all 3 of them described has not been in any accessible location since August 1880. The Pennsylvania State Museum sent it to the Smithsonian in September of that year, and the Smithsonian's accession records for 1880 contain no entry from Bradford County. The 3 physicians' words are in the archive. What their words describe is not. The skulls with the bony projections above the orbital rims are somewhere in the institutional record without a catalog number, in the dark of whatever storage holds them, unchanged since Albert Foote measured the projections at 1 3/4 inches above the orbital rim on the afternoon of July 11, 1880, and wrote down the number with the care of a physician who had been examining bones for 30 years, and who understood that what he was measuring had no category in the literature available to him.